and welcome back to Bookish Theories! In today's video, we'd like to talk about the Star Seekers with Tomorrow by Together, focusing on a little breakdown and analysis of episode 1 and 2 both on Webtoon and on Wattpad to see what they can tell us about this unfolding storyline. Since they finally released the interviews, moreover, today we're starting from a general outline of the storyline, but most importantly from the character's description, because that alone has quite a lot to unpack. Please keep in mind that this video will contain spoilers of chapter 1 and 2 both on Webtoon and on Wattpad, and I'm sorry if this video is gonna be a bit longer than usual, but I've had some technical issues that I had to resolve. Starting from next week, I'm going to cover one episode per week like I'm doing for Seven Fates and Dark Moon, but in the meantime, let's dive right in to see what's going on. Now, the Star Seekers with Tomorrow by Together is a dark fantasy that tells the story of 5 magical boys on a quest to save the world. As we'll see in a second, this is a tale set in a universe where magic and reality coexist, so if on one hand the boys will have to face dangerous missions in order to avoid the apocalypse, on the other, this is also a story about boys discovering their potential in the process of becoming an adult. Now, the premise of the story revolves around the idea that in this reality, magic suddenly came into existence, thus changing the world as people knew it. As we'll see in a second, after this event, people started discovering that they had magic in them, and the music industry, being the industry that it is, eventually started to evolve in order to incorporate this change and profit from it. If the real K-pop industry is very demanding, competitive, and difficult to navigate, the magical one is even worse, because after magic was discovered, the industry got divided into tiers. Those idols with magical powers were classified as tier 1 and were therefore more in demand, whereas the idols without powers were classified as tier 2 and considered less talented because of that. Now, much like it was anticipated all the way back in the Doom's Night, for instance, the protagonists of this story are 5 idols who belong to a group called Star 1. By the time the story begins, the group has been active for the past 3 years and 6 months, and despite the hype surrounding their debut, the boys failed to develop magic powers and got stuck in tier 2 because of that. This, however, will change very soon, because the entire premise of the story is that one day the boys' powers will awaken and their life will change as a result. Now, even if today's episode will mainly focus on the abilities of Subin's character, the film showed us that the other members will develop their own powers as well, so before we get to the Webtoon and the Wattpad, let's meet these characters and see what's going on. We have a lot to unpack. We have an elf, we have a warrior, we have an unusually high amount of birdmen, and also a tree. So let's meet them. Now, first up we have Eugene, which is Yeonjun's character and the eldest member of the group. Eugene is a warrior that is defined by his physical strength, power and prowess. In the interview, it was confirmed that he descends from a long line of fighters belonging to the Deer clan, and because of that, the awakening of his magic will also overlap with the appearance of antlers growing out of his head. Much like it was anticipated in Minisode 1, moreover, we also know that when it comes to the classes inspired by Dungeons and Dragons, Eugene is both a knight and a paladin. These are both classes that focus on physical strength, honor and bravery, but if the knight is a warrior that pledges his allegiance to rulers and noble causes, the paladin is a holy knight that is defined by an oath that he swears to one of the gods within the game. You see, in Dungeons and Dragons, the powers of the paladin largely depend on what type of god the paladin swears to, and this is very important because in the context of the Star Seekers, Eugene did get into a contract, but with the Oddad Cat. Now, since these classes probably refer to the game that they were playing as children, it's possible that the oath of the paladin might also be connected to the promise that they made with the star, but to know if it's one or the other, we'll have to wait and see. Next up we have Viken, who is Beomgyu's character as well as the free spirit of the group. In the interview, Beomgyu described him as a person who seems indifferent on the outside but is actually very warm-hearted on the inside. The strong duality of his personality is also expressed in his power, because if on one hand Viken is a healer who has a strong connection with plants, on the other, thorns grow out of his shoulders whenever he gets upset. This is because in the story, Viken actually belongs to a race of 3 spirits, and this actually connects us right back to his classes in Minisode 1, because Viken was both a druid and a mentalist. Druids, for instance, can be seen as the personification of nature itself, and because of that, their duality is meant to express the different embodiments of nature. Like nature can be sweet and gentle, but also unforgiving and wild, druids share the very same trait, and much like what we see in the story, they also have the ability to be healers and shapeshifters. Mentalists, on the other hand, have the ability to control the minds of others. They can create illusions, lower a creature's will, and they can even access the unconscious with their mind, which is both helpful and dangerous at the same time. Next up we have Tao, which is none other than Taeyeon's inquisitive alter ego. In the interview they told us that Tao is the descendant of an intelligent race of wizard owls, and this also explains why he was associated to this animal back in Nap of a Star. Much like what we saw back in that video as well as in Eternally, Tao can change the color of his eyes, but he also has the ability to interpret magic books. This actually gives him the power of spell casting, and this ability actually connects us right back to the classes that he had in Minisode 1, because back then Tao was a sorcerer and an adventurer. In D&D, a sorcerer is an individual who is born magical and is therefore more prone to perform magic at high levels. The adventurer, on the other hand, is an expert at conducting dangerous expeditions that nobody else wants to do. In the game, this class is usually associated to individuals who are ready to take a risk in order to pursue their goal, so I would say that this is a class that is very fitting for Taeyeon's character as we know him. Next up we have Avis, who is Yunin Kai's character as well as the youngest member of the group. His name is actually very similar to the Latin word for bird, and as it turns out, this might be intentional because much like Tao, Avis is the descendant of a winged race called white birds. This is why in the story Avis has wings, and back in Blue Hour we saw that birds actually did his bidding. Come to think of it, Avis's heritage might also explain why back in the Doom's Night he was so upset about the death of a little bird. In the interview, moreover, Kai also revealed that Avis has the ability to summon powerful beings, and much like it was anticipated by his game name, in the film we do see him summon cute animals. If you look closely, however, these animals are none other than the mascots of Bumgyu and Taeyeon's characters, so much like I mentioned in my past video, Avis might be the one that summoned the animal companions that we also see in the Doom's Night. As it turns out, however, Avis might actually be even more powerful than that, because back in Minisode 1, its classes were Bard and Mystic. The Bard, for instance, is a class capable of both magic and combat, and its main ability is to create magic out of art. The Mystic, instead, is a class that is so powerful that was actually removed from the original game because of that. You see, in D&D, the Mystic was essentially able to do next to anything. Very simply put, we can say the Mystics are essentially masters of the mind. They have telepathy, telekinesis, they can turn invisible, they can transform into metal, and they can even control the physical world and bend it to their will. I think that after a certain level you can even stop aging and essentially live for eternity, so as you can see, Avis is going to be a very powerful bird. I'm like a bird. Last but not least, we finally get Sol, which is Subin's character as well as the leader of the group. Now I'm actually very excited about this because in the interview it was revealed that Sol is actually an elf, and if you remember we already talked about this all the way back when the Doom's Night first came out. Now I'm actually super happy that I got this one right because it means that the general traits of the characters are still pretty much inspired by Dungeons and Dragons. You see, much like we discussed in the past, in Minisode 1, Sol is associated to the Ranger and the Archer, and both of these classes heavily focus on qualities like strength, agility, dexterity, but also intuition. In comparison to the classes of the other members, however, the Ranger and the Archer are a little bit less magical, so to speak, but this didn't make any sense because in the story we already saw Subin not only using magic but also having visions. Now, since the character also has pointy ears, this led me to believe that Sol might have had elven blood, because in D&D having an archer who is also an elf is the best way to make them have magical abilities. On top of that, in the game, elves are a race that have the gift of prophecy, so at the time I thought that it would fit, and as it turns out it actually did. By the looks of it, Sol's gift of prophecy will be an important aspect of the story as a whole, and this idea is also reinforced by both the webtoon and the Wattpad, so without further ado, let's jump right in and start from episode 1 of the webtoon. Now our story begins by introducing us to the concept of magic idols, which, as the name implies, are idols with magical abilities. After the discovery of magic, these were people that gained special abilities and were able to implement them in their performances. From changing their voice to improving their stamina, to straight up shape-shifting and performing magic tricks on stage, these idols could use powers primarily based on water, fire and psychokinesis, and the public was so mesmerized by them that they stopped paying attention to magicless idols instead. Now, to an extent, this kind of makes sense, right? I mean, this new version of Idol essentially has a cheat code that gives them magical autotune and built-in fireworks, so no matter how much the muggles want to work, the magic ones will always be tier 1 and the magic class will always be tier 2. Among the idols in tier 2, this is where Star 1 comes into play, which is a group under UVic Entertainment comprised of the 5 members that we just introduced. Now, even if the 5 members are very talented and ambitious, it's safe to say that in the story, their career did not live up to the hype of their debut. You see, after the discovery of magic, people tended to develop their abilities before becoming an adult, so when Star 1 first debuted, the company hoped that they would come through and become magic idols as time went by. At the beginning, the company actually invested a lot of money in this debut, and the reason behind it was actually Sol himself. This is because in the story, Sol is the son of Lot, which is one of the most famous magic singers in the world. Considering the magic of his famous mother, the company had high expectations about his career, but growing up, Sol's magic didn't come, and to be fair, neither did the magic of the others. After a loss of $6.6 million, the chapter begins with the company cutting their resources to a minimum. They will only have one manager and no company car, so moving forward, the boys will have to move around by bus. Now in this scene, we're also introduced to the main antagonist of the story, because on TV we see the news of a terrorist organization that actually targets idols with magical abilities. I wonder who they will attack next. How about the only ones without powers? Now in this particular day, Star 1 actually have a very good opportunity because Music Bank called them to fill in for Midnight, which is a magic group that couldn't come to their anniversary special. If in real life Music Bank treats Tomorrow by Together like their sons, however, the same cannot be said for the fictional version of them, who looks down on Star 1 for being tier 2 instead of tier 1. Despite the odds are not in their favor, the boys still manage to get a slot for rehearsal, and so still encourages the members to do their best. His positive attitude, however, is very short-lived because as soon as they get on stage, the fire effects go off and triggering Sol a horrible premonition. You see, in the vision, Sol sees 2 glowing red eyes looming over a fiery landscape full of bodies. This is a sight so terrifying that Sol actually ruins the only rehearsal that they had, but little does he know that this is the least of their problems because that very night his vision actually comes true. The moment Star 1 get on stage, a hooded figure attacks the venue and the fiery landscape that Sol saw in his premonition eventually becomes a reality. Now this scene is very interesting because even if the circumstances are completely different, we actually met very similar figures all the way back in the Doom's Night. Back then the boys were walking in an alley when all of a sudden 2 hooded figures dressed in the same way appeared out of nowhere to attack the boys. Much like what we see in the webtoon, this attack triggers the awakening of the boys' powers, but if back in the Doom's Night it was Eugene who put himself in harm's way, this time it's actually Sol. In both cases, the boys are equally surprised by their abilities because if in the animation Eugene looks at his own hands in shock, in the webtoon they literally tell us that this is the first time that such a high level of magic was unleashed by somebody over the age of 19. What can I say, they're late bloomers! This, however, actually opens a very interesting conversation because if in both cases they're showing their powers for the first time, then how come that these 2 versions are so different? Well, up until now we don't know for sure, but my guess is that the 2 scenes might actually be showing us 2 different timelines. You see, like we discussed in some of my past videos, it seems that the Star Seekers might actually be stuck in some sort of time loop. Back in the Doom's Night, for instance, we saw that the Eternity Girl helped Sol go back in time because she knows countless futures. On top of that, the story so far heavily focuses on the theme of fate, predestination, and on the idea that the end of the world is something that is impossible to avoid, and this idea is also mentioned in the Wattpad. If we keep in mind that the premise of the story is that the boys have to save the world even if it seems impossible to save, chances are that they're going to need a little bit of help along the way, and maybe even try again and again before they succeed. After all, if they don't like this game, they can just reset it, so it's possible that the differences that we see are because of different timelines being shown at the same time. As we see in a second, it seems that the Wattpad might be showing us yet another timeline altogether because the story told on that platform is completely different from this one. If you look closely, however, despite of the differences, there are also some key similarities that are worth keeping in mind. In both cases, for instance, the first one who gets attacked is actually Avis, because if in the Doom's Night he is hit by the magic circle, in the webtoon he is trapped by the chains. Both Eugene and Soul, moreover, have their magical awakening as a form of defense because their powers actually manifest the moment that they have to defend others from danger. Last but not least, however, it's also important to point out that these awakenings are actually triggered by the very same entities, because if in the alley they are attacked by two hooded figures, at Music Bank they are attacked by a very similar figure wearing the same clothes. But who are these people? Well, if we follow the information that we have so far, this is a terrorist organization that targets magic idols. However, if we go on Wattpad, the summary actually calls this organization the Dragon Slayer Clan, which incidentally also matches the Spanish version of the webtoon, which in turn calls it the Cult of the Dragon Slayers, El Culto de Matadragones. Now this is actually very interesting because back in the film, if you remember, the boys were wearing a uniform with a dragon symbol on it, and according to the Spanish summary, the reappearance of this dragon symbol has something to do with the boys' quest to avoid the apocalypse. Now this idea actually connects us right to episode 2, where the attacker goes back to base and tells his superior about what happened. At this point, we discovered that the reason behind these idol attacks was to find the so-called Boys of Destiny, which I'm assuming are boys who are destined to save the world. The original target of this attack was actually the group the Star One was called to fill in for, but when the attacker tried to get rid of them, Soul unleashed a power that was beyond the human imagination. Now, despite his initial disappointment, the leader of this cult is actually very interested in this event, because whether or not the Star One are the Boys of Destiny, this kind of power must be dealt with as soon as possible. Because of that, he orders his subordinate to eliminate the threat the Star One might represent and lure Soul in by using what he cares about the most. Now this is very interesting because at this point we get the sense that this cult is not so much against idols but rather against magic. Since we know that they are called the Dragon Slayers, it's possible that the magic that they are trying to fight might actually come from the power of the dragon, but whether this is the case or not, we'll have to wait and see. In the meantime, however, the story continues with Soul waking up at the hospital after the attack at Music Bank. The sudden manifestation of his power actually left physical marks on his body, and even if the other members are all very worried about him, Avis is the most affected because he blames himself for the accident. Despite of Avis's guilt, however, what happened to Soul is something incredible because no adult has ever manifested such a huge power before. As it turns out, moreover, Soul's manifestation might have actually saved their career altogether, because when the CEO comes in to visit, he reveals that his attack went viral and now everybody wants to know about Star One. From magicless idols nobody wanted to see on stage, the boys became breaking news overnight, so from tier 2 they are now tier 1 idols. Because of that, the CEO hired a man called DK, who will be their new manager as well as their new magical trainer. Now if we take a look at the Wattpad, DK is a character that will show up in that version as well, but if in the webtoon he came in chapter 2, in the Wattpad he show up in chapter 6, thus confirming that the two versions of the story are indeed different from one another. In the webtoon, this man is portrayed as a very intimidating individual that will manage them as they become tier 1 idols, but right from the beginning we get the sense that his role in the story will be more important than what it seems. You see, after a week of the boys enjoying their newly found stardom, we catch up with Star One being interviewed on a show, and in this instance we discover that Avis is still blaming himself for what happened. After the schedule ends, the boys go back to the van in order to leave the venue, when all of a sudden DK tells Soul that the CEO wants to talk to him in private. As the rest of the members are left in the van wondering why DK is so sketchy and didn't actually teach them any magic, we as the audience are about to find out, because the moment Soul is lured away, DK's plan is actually revealed. You see, in the story, DK confirms that Soul's magic is something special, so special in fact that it might be able to save the world. In order to teach him how to handle this power, but also to see if Soul is worthy of it to begin with, however, DK has to see it for himself first. Using his telepathic abilities, DK actually activates the van with the other members inside and directs the car towards a crossroads. This is something that obviously terrifies them, and as they are about to crash, we also get a glimpse of Avis's backstory, because we discover that as a child he seemingly suffered the death of a sister and a parent. In the meantime, however, DK's test seems to work, because the moment Sol sees his members in danger, he manifests his powers yet again. Before the car crashes against a truck, Sol creates a shield that actually avoids the impact. All of a sudden, however, the shield breaks and the car eventually crashes, so as we see Sol running towards the scene, the episode ends with a hand lying in a pool of blood. Now, by the looks of it, the car crash had a very bad outcome, so what does this mean then? Does it mean that DK is an evil character, or that maybe belongs to the cult that we saw at the beginning? Bear in mind that the Dragon Slayer told the other to get rid of Star 1 and bait Sol with the thing that he loves the most, so what we saw unfolding does fit the plan, because DK essentially used the members to lure the leader out. At the same time, however, it seems to be an obvious connection to make, and as of right now, it actually seems that DK might be more of an ally than an enemy. To know how things will play out, we'll have to wait for the next episode to come out, but in the meantime we have the Wattpad to unpack, where, as a matter of fact, the story begins with a similar episode involving the van and the Black Water. Now, chapter 1 on Wattpad is called Dream of the Beginning, and this episode begins with Sol dreaming a memory of a destined future that involves the apocalypse and chaos taking over the world. Much like it was anticipated in songs like Frost, for instance, Sol is depicted in a situation that is so scary and hopeless that he cannot do anything but laugh at his own desperation. In the dream, Sol himself is aware that what he's witnessing is something that he cannot avoid, and this sense of predestination is followed by him essentially falling into madness. Now, even if we cannot know for sure, what Sol sees in the dream actually seems like a mix between what he saw in the Doom's Night and what happened back in Magic Island. In the dream, he sees thick globs of blood dripping and a huge figure eventually appearing in front of him in a wasteland. While this foam takes off and starts flying around him, the narration also describes black lamps laughing at him as they eventually consume the entire world. While Sol stands in a wasteland, the flight of this giant creature causes a wind that is so strong that he is unable to withstand it. As I mentioned earlier, this scene is very reminiscent of what we saw back in Magic Island, with the only difference being that at this point Sol is so far gone that he cannot do anything but laugh at his own misery. Now, when the dream ends and Sol eventually wakes up, Eugene is concerned, and rightfully so. All the members are in the van, and Eugene is actually trying to make sure that Sol is alright, and at this point we get an insight on the strong bond that these boys actually share. In this episode, for instance, Eugene is presented as a person with a very strong exterior that doesn't seem to like smiling very much. When it comes to Sol, however, Eugene doesn't hesitate to show his softer side, and this is something that Viken actually mocks him for. You see, the thing with Sol is that since he's the leader, he thinks that he has to bear the burden of his dreams all by himself. This is not really the case though, because Eugene is there to take care of him and the other members are by his side as well. Despite of this strong friendship, however, the dreams still take a toll on him, and in the van we actually get to see to what extent. If at the beginning these dreams were just dreams, and now Sol is starting to hallucinate as well, so these nightmares are showing up when he is asleep but also when he is wide awake. In the scene of the van, for instance, Sol suddenly hallucinates the road lifting up and swallowing them all, but just as his vision is starting to get blurry, Eugene caresses his face and brings him back to reality. Despite his members are very worried about him, Sol actually tries to convince them that his dreams are nothing more than that. They are nightmares that he has because he is stressed out, because their career is going downhill, and at this point Sol gets so upset about this that he clenches his fist and actually cuts his own palms with his nails. You see, Star 1 here are basically the only idols without magic that are left in the industry, so even if being a muggle is not illegal per se, we get the sense that the boys get a lot of hate for their lack of abilities. This is because no matter how hard they try, magic idols can reach a level of quality that without magic is impossible to achieve. The magic ones are cheating a little bit, you know. They can change voice, sing notes that normal people cannot sing, and they can even shapeshift into a better version of themselves, so as you can see, the competition is unfair. Now at this point we finally get to know where these magic idols came from and why society actually evolved the way that it did. Now, according to the narration, everything started about 10 years ago when a cataclysmic event took place and Earth split and remerged once again. Now, right off the bat, bold choice going with the global catastrophe, but fair enough. Okay. Now, after this event took place, the world essentially turned upside down. The energy created by the split sent a shockwave to the ground, and as the ground reeled, a lot of people lost their memories. Now, in the story, Sol is one of the people that doesn't remember this event, and I think that this is going to be very interesting in the future because there are high chances that the boys themselves might have been involved in this event. If you think about it, at the time Sol was about 9 years old, and this age actually matches the scenes where the children are playing in the Doom's Night and Nap of a Star. On top of that, the main concept of that part of the story is that the boys don't have to forget. Like, they have to remember Magic Island, how it all began, they have to remember the Star Song, they have to remember their promise, but 10 years ago the boys forgot, or at the very least Sol did, which I think is gonna be very important moving forward. As of right now, however, Sol has no idea what happened back then, and since so far the story is told from his perspective, up until now neither do we. What we do know, however, is that after this event took place, the world essentially changed overnight because people started discovering that they could perform magic. Now, this is the coolest thing ever, right? And in the story we get the sense that the initial reaction was very positive as well. People were happy, and scholars thought that the age of magic would bring humanity to the next stage of evolution. This, however, didn't really take place because despite people invested a lot of money in the research, scientists never found anything and interest died down after a few years. Like, this part of the story has the same energy of those people in Jurassic Park that said, you know, people lost interest in dinosaurs, so we had to create that giant monstrosity of a hybrid that kills people and eats us all. Like, what? What do you mean people lost interest in dinosaurs? No, they didn't. And people wouldn't stop researching magic either after a few years. Like, people write papers on the way the Romans used to store fish, but they didn't find anything. Well, because you didn't look long enough. Also, like, people can shapeshift. They can create water out of thin air. Like, yeah, we didn't find nothing. Are you sure? I have so many questions. Anyway, since the interest in magic apparently died down and turned out to be nothing more than party tricks, magic eventually found its niche in entertainment, because of course it did. This is how magic idols were created and how magicless idols essentially lost their jobs, all of them that is, with the exception of Star 1. Now, despite them being one of a kind, Star 1 are not having a great time at this point because people hate on them and they essentially want them to disband. At this point we get the sense that the boys are very desperate to get their magic because they feel outdated and they feel out of place. In this world of magic idols there is no place for people like them, and Sol is so frustrated about this that he actually feels like they belong to ancient times. Now, this is a very interesting comment, especially if we keep in mind that part of the story will be set in a magical land that seemingly belongs to a more ancient past. This might just be a coincidence, of course, but Sol feeling like he belongs to another time and another space might actually foreshadow their identity as boys of destiny moving forward. Whether this is the case or not, however, we get the sense that the boys are very desperate to get their magic, and the members that seem to want it the most is actually Eugene, who is even ready to believe the scams that go around and the promise to teach magic for money. As Sol tries to comfort him the best that he can, the conversation is suddenly halted by something unexpected, because before they know it, the car stops with a screech and the members are violently shoved forward. This is how Chapter 1 ends and how Chapter 2 actually begins, and in this new episode we discover that after this sudden halt, the driver lost control of the vehicle and eventually skid across the road. Luckily enough, the 5 members did not suffer any injuries, but the same cannot be said for the manager, whom they find half unconscious in the driver's seat. Now, despite the initial panic, Sol is also very confused because even if the manager is unresponsive, there are no injuries, there is no blood, and the car itself is actually intact. When Eugene tries to call an ambulance, however, nobody actually picks up, and when the members eventually exit the van, they discover all the cars in disarray and smoke rising up in the sky. Now, at this point, Sol assumes that this is a pile-up, but Viken eventually comes through with the truth. You see, according to the latest breaking news, this accident was actually caused by a shockwave that was originated by the successful extraction of the black water. Now, the black water here is a source of energy that is seemingly able to create a magnetic field that amplifies in the vicinity of metallic vehicles. Considering its name, it's probably the black liquid that we see in the sinkhole in Frost and in the teaser, but also the swirling substance that we saw in the black hole of Act Boy. On top of that, back in the webtoon, the van actually crashed into a tank truck that contained black water, so if in this version this substance has just been extracted, we can assume that in the webtoon the black water is already on the market. Now, according to the Wattpad, the black water is something that initially appeared when the Earth opened up 10 years ago. If the investors lost interest in magic, however, they sure did not lose interest in the black water to the point that some rumors started to spread. You see, according to a conspiracy theory, the real reason why people failed to study magic was because humanity is actually controlled by an organization that trains in magic and that rules over the black water. Now, since this is the only theory that they mention, this is probably true and foreshadowing the events that will take place later on in the story. In the meantime, however, we get the sense that the scientists have been trying to extract this substance for quite a long time. Sure enough, on the day when this story is set, they eventually succeeded, but little did they know that this extraction would also cause a black water wave that would give a lot of people a lot of side effects, especially when in the vicinity of metallic vehicles. These side effects include nausea and even paralysis for up to 3 days, but what's interesting about this is that its exposure only affects people without magic. Bear in mind, in the event the only one affected was the manager, so this little clue already foreshadows the idea that the boys are magical, even if in this timeline they didn't manifest their powers just yet. This, however, is bound to change very soon, because as the boys are trying to extract people from their cars, Saul actually notices that the little cuts that he got on his palms disappeared without a trace. This sight actually reminds him of his dreams, and at this point he finally realizes that the desolation that he sees around him is actually something that he already saw in his dreams in the past. When Saul eventually understands that his dreams might be a premonition of the future, he is terrified of this realization because inside of his mind he has the feeling that this is just the beginning. In the meantime, however, the last part of the chapter is actually set a few days after the incident, and at this point the manager is still nowhere to be seen. If in the outside world the main topic of conversation is on the extraction of the black water, in the practice room Star 1 is focused on rehearsal. Now in this scene we essentially get the impression of how hardworking and dedicated the members actually are. Since they are the only non-magical idols left, their performance has to be perfect, so after practice is over, Eugene singles out Tao and tells him to practice even more. When Tao tries to reason with him and goes to Saul for help, the leader eventually sides with Eugene, so Tao is forced to keep on practicing with the eldest. While the two of them keep on working, however, Saul's vision gets blurry once again, so he's forced to sit down and take a break. This chapter ends with Saul drifting out of consciousness and going back to the windy wasteland of his dreams, but to know what this premonition will show him, we'll have to wait and see. So what do you think? Are you enjoying it so far? Let me know in the comments down below. In the meantime, I hope you guys enjoyed this very long video, and if you did, please think about liking and subscribing. As always, thank you so much for watching, guys. I'll see you next time. Bye bye!